Welcome, everybody, to our first day of the Homosaurus training series. So I just wanted to give a quick introduction. So first off, I wanted to thank Maya Anderson, Kat Lewis, Leslie Lowry, Amy Kokenauer, and Elizabeth Duell for their support and their hard work bringing us all together and ironing out all the logistics to make this workshop happen. The idea for this training came out of a collaboration between the CSG and the SILS group, which really recognized a need in our community for some guidance on how we could all get started on doing this. And another piece of our collaboration was putting together a webpage to click training resources and FAQs that'll help Alliance Library staff get started on using Homosaurus. So a big thanks to the members of both CSG and SILS for their work pulling that document together. We will keep adding more questions and answers as they surface, and we're also planning to post the recordings of this training series on that page. So I'll drop a link in chat there in a moment, and also it's accessible from the CSG webpage and the Tech Services documentation page. And now we are so pleased to have Adrian Williams with us today to begin our three-part training series on using Homosaurus. Adrian is the cataloging and metadata librarian at the University of Kentucky Libraries. The research and service interests include critical cataloging and classification and LGBTQ+ inclusive bibliographic description. They are a member of the Homosaurus editorial board, Trans Metadata Collective, Queer Metadata Collective, and the ALA Core Subject Analysis Committee. Adrian, please take it away.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Maya, Elizabeth, Leslie, and everyone else who have brought me in and worked with me to put this training series together for the Orbis Cascade Alliance. We'll get into the thick of Homosaurus next week, but I'll go ahead and give a spiel for those who aren't familiar with it at all. Homosaurus is a linked data supplementary vocabulary that is centered on LGBTQ+ people, identities, and contexts. Like MESH or medical subject headings, Homosaurus is intended to function as a supplementary vocabulary. It's meant to be a companion to more general vocabularies like Library of Congress subject headings or SEER subject headings. Today, we'll discuss LGBTQ+ identities and contexts. My previous training workshops didn't include this primer because I considered it to be a separate subject. I also assumed that if people were coming to a training on using Homosaurus, that they had either received EDI training on LGBTQ+ identities or had done their own work to prime themselves on LGBTQ+ identities and histories. When it got to the live practice component of my workshop, I found that that was not the case for everyone. And so on this first day, I'm going to provide some foundational gender and sexuality concepts to ground us all in. And then on June 7th and June 14th, we'll more deeply discuss Homosaurus itself and how to implement Homosaurus-related projects at you all's institutions. If you feel that this sort of EDI training is something you already know about, I still encourage you to stick around because while we talk about LGBTQ+ identities, I'll also be describing them within the context of Homosaurus and how Homosaurus describes and categorizes these identities. We'll also be discussing briefly intersections between LGBTQ+ communities and disabled communities and LGBTQ+ communities and race and ethnicity communities. So why is it important that catalogers be primed on LGBTQ+ context and subject analysis? It's important because you will be cataloging about living people. While you can get away with not knowing much about mathematics or engineering or World War II and still catalog those works well enough, cataloging works about LGBTQ+ people and other marginalized groups can be harmful if it's not done right. It can make it more difficult for those groups to find materials for and about themselves, and it can be harmful to see subject headings tied to those works that do not actually match what those works are about. It can also be harmful to see subject headings that are outdated and offensive. So that briefly is why it's important to do this work right. In order to start doing this work right, I'm firstly going to ground us in a few shared understandings. These understandings will be repeated throughout the next couple of weeks, but I'm also going to lay them out here so that they're on you all's mind as we move through the rest of these trainings. This first understanding is self-identification. I'm going to explain a lot of identities and labels today and what those labels mean for a lot of the people who use them. It's important to remember that while these identities have definitions, and while some have clear roles, gender expressions, and stereotypes attached to them, the only thing that makes a person any one identity is them self-identifying as that identity. You should not ascribe to any real person an identity that they do not claim for themselves, regardless of how their behaviors or gender expressions fit that label. The second understanding is slow work over fast mistakes. The description of living peoples will always be incomplete. It will never be done. It will take constant work and revision. And it's better that that cataloging work is done step by step, book by book, rather than done in batch. How one work approaches transness or how it discusses lesbians and lesbian history might be different than other books that describe that history. And my time cataloging using Homosaurus and in participating in the development of terms for Homosaurus, I found that working slowly rather than in batch has been the more effective option. Slow work is not bad work, it's great work. It means that we're making sure that things get done right rather than get done on time. The third is positionality. I'm talking as a queer, trans, Black American whose experience in learning around gender and sexuality is largely informed by the European American understanding of gender and sexuality. I imagine that that's the case for many of the attendees of this training. And so for myself and for you all, it's important to name that while what I talk about today is one understanding of gender, one understanding of sexuality, there are many others in the world. The Homosaurus has terms from cultures all over the world and is adding more as we learn about them and get in touch with those communities. And while I hope for this primer to be helpful in providing some basic understandings, I hope that attendees will do the work needed to catalog works that have to do with genders and sexualities outside of what will be discussed today and for the next couple of weeks. Okay, sexual and romantic identities. One sexual identity is how one perceives or does not perceive oneself as a sexual being. It can also be thought of as how one thinks of oneself in terms of to whom one is or is not sexually attracted. Sexual identities include identities such as lesbian, gay, pansexual, or queer, and it can also include identities like asexual, demisexual, or any number of other aspec identities. One's romantic identity has a similar definition, that being how one perceives or does not perceive oneself as a romantic being. Sexual identity and romantic identity are often conflated with each other in dominant culture. However, the reality is that while many people hold the same sexual and romantic identity, there are plenty of other people who experience being romantically attracted to someone while not necessarily being sexually attracted to them, and vice versa. It's important for people who plan on cataloging using Homosaurus to know how Homosaurus describes different sexualities and romantic identities. Homosaurus describes lesbians, for example, as individuals who identify as lesbian and belong to lesbian communities. While the term has predominantly been used to describe women who are exclusively or primarily romantically and/or sexually attracted to other women, Homosaurus makes space for people who are gender diverse and gender nonconforming, who self-identify as lesbians or who belong to lesbian communities. We make that similar space in our scope note for sapphics, butches, femmes, and other terms that are related to lesbian communities and contexts. In contrast to lesbians, Homosaurus uses the term gay men to primarily describe men or masks who are sexually and or romantically attracted to other men or masks. Mask here, M-A-S-C, is short for someone whose gender identity is masculine, but who does not necessarily identify as a man. Outside of Homosaurus, gay generally means any person who is attracted to their own gender or sex. In the past, that word has been homosexual, and that word still exists, but it's not as used by like actual people these days. And LCSH, gays is a gender neutral term and is meant to be a catch-all term for any person who identifies as gay. And Homosaurus is gendered and is specifically for gay men and masculine people. Historically, having gays as a catch-all term has conflated LGBTQ plus people more broadly with gay people, which has invisibilized and misrepresented people who do not want to use that term for themselves. So Homosaurus gendering gay is intentional. While anyone can identify as gay, it's important in description work to only use it for people who want it used for them. Polysexuality is the attraction a person feels toward various, but not necessarily others. Polysexuality is an umbrella term, and it can include sexualities such as bisexuality and pansexuality. Polysexuality is distinct from polyamory, and that while polyamory is the practice and or desire for more than one sexual, romantic, or queer platonic relationship simultaneously, polysexuality is rather the attraction to multiple genders, not necessarily the attraction to multiple people at the same time. So polysexuality, an attraction to any sort of gender, polyamory, an attraction to multiple people at the same time. Bisexuality is the sexual attraction to more than one gender or sex. Historically, this has meant an attraction to men and women, but these days it typically means an attraction to your own gender or sex, as well as at least one other gender or sex. Even though bi etymologically means two, you don't have to only be attracted to two genders to identify as bisexual. Pansexuality is very similar to bisexuality. It's distinct, and that is an attraction to people regardless of their sex, gender, and gender expression. While bisexual people might be attracted to a certain gender for any number of certain reasons, pansexual people, within its definition, are attracted to genders regardless of how they look. It is just, if you're a person that I'm attracted to, then you're a person I'm attracted to. Whereas bisexual people is more, I am attracted to these genders. It's important to note that someone can be attracted to all genders and still identify as bisexual. It's merely down to one's personal preference and their exposure to other similar terms. Queerness can mean several things in the context of LGBTQ plus people and identities. It can describe identities that exist outside of or in between different identities. It can also describe identities that actively resist normative understandings of sexuality and or gender. And it can also be used as a verb to queer something, which means to take something and look at it through a queer lens, to question that concept's foundations, biases, and what it includes and what it leaves out, how it fits into dominant normative structures, and then to change that concept in a way that opposes that dominant structure. And our scope notes for lesbians and gay men, the Homosaurus editorial board queers typical definitions for those identities by broadening them to include non-binary or otherwise gender non-conforming people. Queerness inherently resists definition. And so the different descriptions that I've offered are not necessarily mutually exclusive to one another. They can describe any one person and any one person's actions or political framework. Queer as an identity term is more often used by younger people than older people because of the history of how it's been used against LGBTQ people as a slur. Because of that history and because of self-identification is important in any regard, you should only use the term queer to describe works about people who explicitly self-identify with the term queer, or about works that explicitly discuss queerness as a concept, identity, or activist framework. And I recognize that I'm running through these quickly, and I just want to point out that today's training will be broken into 3 sections. And after each section, I'll provide a Q&A to cover things that are about that like specific group of terms that I was discussing. So I explained sexual and romantic identity some slides ago, but I'll remind you all that sexual and romantic identity is one's internal perception or lack of perception as a sexual and or romantic being. The labels that we just discussed fall within the allosexual umbrella, the sexual identities that experience sexual desire. For the next couple of slides, we'll talk about the part of that definition where it discusses the lack of sexual attraction, and the lack of romantic attraction. Asexuality is generally defined as a lack of sexual attraction or desire for sex. Like sexuality is generally regarded as a spectrum that you can fall along, with some people who fall under the asexual umbrella experiencing no desire for sex, while some, like demisexuals, experience sexual attraction after getting to know someone well. Again, the opposite of asexuality is allosexuality, ALLO, sexuality. Allosexuality is the experience of sexual attraction. It's regarded as the dominant identity among most people, and it's the identity that's most encouraged by European and American society. Aromanticism is the general lack of romantic attraction or romantic desire for other people. Many of the identities that fall under the asexual spectrum have aromantic counterparts, like demi-romantic, fray romantic, and gray romantic. One important thing to remember, and I know I stated this earlier, but I feel like it's pertinent to repeat it here, is that one's sexual/asexual identity and one's romantic/aromantic identity do not have to align. Someone can be a gay man who is romantically attracted to men, but who does not experience sexual attraction to men. Someone can be bisexual and homoromantic, and someone can also be both asexual and aromantic. So that is briefly some of the sexual identities that exist, both within Homosaurus and more broadly. If people have questions about sexual identities, I can answer questions about them briefly before we move on to talking about gender identities.
Feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. We have a question in the chat. Are all these terms in the glossary that the Alliance has put together?
I'm not sure, but Holly or Maya, do you know?
Yeah, I can answer that. So what we've put together isn't a glossary, it's sort of an FAQ of, how do I use Homosaurus? How does it work specifically in an alliance context? So for any glossary things, you would want to refer to Homosaurus itself.
I see that Rebecca has asked, is there a source that would have these definitions that you just presented as a resource? And Adam answered it. Each of these terms are in Homosaurus and have scope notes attached to them. As of the June release that will happen tomorrow or sometime in June, every term in Homosaurus will have a scope note. It's taken a while to get there, but we are finally at the point where every term will have a scope note that will provide descriptions, definitions for each of these terms, including the ones that I've discussed today. Yeah, yay, scope notes. Yeah, scope notes are great, especially for living identities that sometimes change and evolve. It's really important to have those scope notes. Benjamin asks, ooh, got away from me there. Benjamin asks, any recommendations for reference resources would be great. I imagine Wikipedia provides some resources, but just noted that phrase sexual isn't included there. There's also an LGBTQ+ wiki if you Google LGBTQIA+ wiki, you'll find that wiki, and it provides pretty much Wikipedia pages for a whole lot of identities, including free sexual and a whole lot of like micro labels that people may not be aware of. Mary asks, do we only use a term in a record if the author/item self-identifies? That is recommended, yes. If it is a term that was, or if it was a work that is written by someone who is not a part of that group, then you use the term that the author has used after, using your cataloger's judgment to see if that is good to do. For historical works where queer things happen, same-sex things happen, but like the term is not necessarily used, then that's tricky. And something that the Queer Metadata Collective is doing is writing recommendations for that. And we hope to have just more guidelines on how to handle those more historical works in the future. Adam says, Wikidata probably has all the terms with descriptions. Yes, that's fair. Yeah. And then thank you, Holly. Okay. I think with that, let's dive back into the training. Are my slides still up? Just want to make sure.
They are.
Awesome. Okay. So gender identity is defined as one's internal sense of one's own gender. While historically it's been conflated with one's biological sex, the two are distinct. Your biological sex has to do with your status, often legal, as female, male, or intersex, depending on your chromosomes, productive organs, external genitalia, and other biological characteristics. Gender and contrast can include the socially constructed roles, behaviors, and expressions that one performs, often as a reflection of and reaction to your home culture's expectations around masculinity and femininity. There are different understandings of what masculinity and femininity means across different cultures. And so what's expected of a man in one culture can be different from what's expected of a man in another culture. While Euro-American imperialism has done a lot of work trying to constrain what masculinity versus femininity is, these culturally specific differences still exist in a wealth of different cultures globally. So in Homosaurus, if a work is describing the concept of masculinity or the concept of femininity, we have the terms masculinities, plural, and femininities, plural, available. I'm going to very quickly take a drink. So when we talk about biological sex and social gender and their alignment and non-alignment with each other, we typically think of cisgender identity as being when a person's sex and gender are in alignment with each other. It's when the gender you feel internally is the same as the gender that's expected of you, and is also the same as the gender you were assigned at birth. The dominant narrative around gender is that your gender will typically agree with your sex, and that far less often it will not. I think we can all think of cisgender women, though, whose gender expression does not align with the Euro-American Christian dominant stereotype of womanhood, and cisgender men whose gender expression does not align perfectly with the culture stereotype of manhood. This is not me saying that these people hold the trans identity. It's rather me saying that gender is more fluid than we tend to think it is, and that is very much constructed by society rather than being a hard and flexible part of someone's body. Something else we have to understand is that gender, just like culture, is ever evolving. Yesterday's understanding of gender is not today's, and today's understanding of gender will not be tomorrow. It is changing every day. Male and female are the two legal genders that exist in most of the United States and in most countries in Europe. This reflects the two most common variations in biological sex, but it does not account for any other variations. Intersex people are those who are born with variations in their genitalia, hormones, internal anatomy, and/or chromosomes that do not fully or exclusively conform to medical or social expectations for males or females. Historically, when intersex characteristics are apparent at birth, parents have been encouraged by medical professionals to raise that child with the gender assignment their biological sex characteristics most closely aligns with. Part of that has meant, quote unquote, correcting intersex children who express gender behaviors that do not align with their assigned gender. Historically, intersex people of all ages have also been coerced into hormone replacement procedures or quote unquote normalization surgeries to further align with their assigned gender. Many intersex organizations, including the Intersex Society of North America and Interact, have advocated against these normalization surgeries and gender corrective therapies, and have advocated for increased awareness that intersex characteristics are natural rather than being something that need to be corrected. Because of the marginalization that the intersex community faces, it's included in the larger LGBTQ plus community. Intersex people can be cis. They can identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And they can also be trans and not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. While Homosaurus does not currently hold many intersex community specific terms, we're currently working with Interact to expand our terms having to do with intersex identity, experience, and history. And we hope for those terms to be available in our December release. Your understanding and your sense of your own gender tends to develop as you age, as you are exposed to the gender expectations and gender roles and behaviors of your home culture, and as you grow to understand your own internal self. For me, I knew I wasn't a girl by the time I was 6 years old. I didn't have the language to communicate that to my family in a way that they would understand, but I knew. For other people, that realization comes later in life for any number of reasons. But other people know from childhood their internal sense of their own gender and whether or not it aligns with what is expected of them. When the gender you are assigned at birth doesn't align with the internal gender that you feel for yourself, you can identify as transgender. Transgender is also an umbrella term for various trans identities and experiences. I say an umbrella term because there are many cultures where people experience some concept of transness, and the term transgender is only the English language and the Euro-American understanding of that experience. Transsexual used to be a synonym of transgender back when our understanding of transness was tied more to the destination of binary gender transition and reassignment rather than the experience of being trans. These days, it falls under the transgender umbrella as one experience of transness. That experience being either a trans person who has started the process of socially and or medically transitioning to a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, and or a person who identifies as a binary identity, such as a man or a woman. You don't have to identify as transsexual to identify with a binary gender, and you do not have to identify as a binary gender to identify as transgender or as transsexual. But that is one definition for what transsexual means for the people who identify using it. The term transsexual is used far less often these days, but it is still used by older generations as well as some younger people who prefer that term to be used for them. There are also several terms under the umbrella of transgender identity, or which can otherwise be understood to be a transgression of gender expectations. For example, non-binary identity. The term non-binary describes those whose gender is outside of the gender binary. While non-binary identity is often considered an identity under the trans umbrella, you do not have to identify as transgender to identify as non-binary. Many non-binary people use they, them, or other gender neutral pronouns, but not all non-binary people do. to speak about a gender neutral person who like uses they, them, or AM pronoun sets, the singular gender neutral grammar structure works like this. Like, they went to the store to get some new shoes for themselves. Or, did you get a chance to follow up with them about when they're flying in? You can use they, them, AM in much of the same grammar way. Singular, gender neutral. Some non-binary people also use binary pronouns like she, her, or he, him exclusively, or in combination with gender neutral pronouns for any number of reasons. Some non-binary people feel that their gender expression or behaviors leans toward the feminine or masculine end of the binary. And so they use both the binary pronoun that is tied to one end of the binary, while also using a non-binary pronoun set. Others are on a journey with their gender, still deciding what pronouns they like and what they want to be called. And while they're figuring that out, they ask people to refer to them using different pronoun sets to just see what feels right to them when they're called that. And then some people decide that because they often end up getting misgendered as a binary gender, regardless of their actual gender identity, that they provide that option to people as a sort of reclamation of, I'm going to be called he, him anyway, at least I can do it on my own terms. It's up to the individual what pronoun set or what sets they use, what they want to be called or what they're willing to be called. A person, non-binary or otherwise, is also not required to keep the pronoun set or the name that they announce at any one point. You can change your pronoun set as you see fit. Gender fluid people have a gender identity that changes over time. For some gender fluid people, that amount of time is fairly predictable, and for some it is, and for some it isn't as predictable. The gender that gender fluid people are fluid between can be any range of genders. For some gender fluid people, is two, is man or non-binary, man or woman. And for other gender fluid people, it can be as many genders as they know. It just depends on that person and how they define gender fluid identity within themselves. Agender identity is often placed under the non-binary identity umbrella, but it can also be understood as its own gender identity. Those that identify as agender can identify as it for any number of reasons, including but not limited to when they don't identify with any gender, particularly those within the gender binary, those who identify as gender neutral, those who experience an absence of a feeling of gender, or those who reject the concept of gender completely. Like non-binary and gender fluid people, agender people can have any gender expression or behavior, and that expression can change as they see fit. It just, depends on how they want to be called, how they want to be seen. There are hundreds of sexual identities and gender identities that were not covered today and will not be covered today. And I encourage folks as they start doing subject analysis for LGBTQ plus library and archival materials in the months to come to learn more about those identities. Before we move to the gender specific Q&A and then onto the third section of today's training, I'll close with these words by feminist and gender theorist Judith Butler. It is always brave to insist on undergoing transformations that feel necessary and right, even when there are so many obstructions to doing so, including people and institutions who seek to pathologize or criminalize such important acts of self-definition. I know that for some, it feels less brave than necessary, but we all have to defend those necessities that allow us to live and breathe in the way that feels right to us. Surgical intervention can be precisely what a trans person needs. It is also not always what a trans person needs. Either way, one should be free to determine the course of one's gendered life. Okay, are there any gender-related questions that people have? Paige asks, do you have suggested sources for people who want to keep learning? When the full slides come out, I'm going to have at the end about like 3 slides of resources that people can dig into. I believe those slides will be shared out after the training series is done. I'm using just one solid slide deck so that it's easier to keep track of. Yeah, thank you for asking. Okay. If anyone has questions about gender, feel free to think on them and ask them at the end. Okay. So this section will discuss intersectionality between LGBTQ plus identities and race and ethnicity, and LGBTQ plus identities with disability. This is my first time trying to distill this into one of these trainings, and so I welcome informed feedback on this section, especially. Discussing these topics in depth and in the depth that they would deserve would also take a lot longer than 10 minutes. Discussion of any of these intersectionalities would take up a full semester. And so rather than trying to drill into them, I'm going to approach them from more of a naming basis of naming the fact that these intersectionalities exist and that conflicts between these intersectionalities exist. And I'm also going to spotlight some scholars and resources for folks to explore in their own time. The ones that I will spotlight are just selected resources. They are not the end all be all to intersectionality as it pertains to LGBTQ plus identities and intersectionality more broadly. I imagine that for many of you, the EDI trainings you've received thus far have approached sexuality and gender in a vacuum, and probably from a white, cis-normative, able-bodied perspective. It's important to understand that for many people in the world, one isn't just queer or just trans. Many people are queer and Black, trans and disabled, gay and an immigrant. And those intersections bring unique and profound differences in the ways that they are received by queer and trans communities, how people create their own communities, and how people are received by and acted upon by capitalist structures and by our government. It's important to understand that no one, not a single one of us, is only one thing. We each bring diverse lived experiences and biases and privileges to the work we do. It's important that when you all start getting into this work, that you're mindful of what implicit biases you might be bringing, not just about queerness or gender, but about race, class, and disability as well. Historically and currently, queer communities of color have faced marginalization and alienation from white queer communities. Because of the axes of privilege and prejudice that white people are brought up with, they are more likely to harm and hold harmful perceptions about queer and Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. Because of the privileges and prejudices that cis men are brought up with, they are more likely to harm and hold harmful perceptions about cis women and trans people. And because of the privileges and prejudices that able-bodied people are brought up with, they are more likely to harm and hold harmful perceptions about disabled people. In the 20th and earlier 21st century, for example, white gay liberation for many white people meant assimilation into mainstream society. That mainstream society was and continues to be racist and xenophobic. It meant being able to participate in society as a citizen with rights and assurances of safety equal to their white straight counterparts. And while there have always been coalitions between groups to work toward mutual improvements and how folks are treated, there have also always been people in more privileged groups who have been willing to ignore, sideline, and undermine more marginalized groups if it meant that they could receive privileges by being a part of a more socially dominant group. The assimilationist aspirations of white gay and lesbian culture have often meant that disabled queer people, white or otherwise, were also marginalized or otherwise excluded from mainstream white culture. Physical differences and disabilities and mental and intellectual differences and disabilities to this day are seen by mainstream society as being not only unattractive and undesirable, but as characteristics that shouldn't exist at all. While there is work being done to tear down that stigma, it's still one of the primary responses to these intercultural marginalizations has been to create safe and affirming spaces within and between intersectional groups, to create groups and spaces for queer people of color, for trans, housing, and secure people, for queer and trans people with disabilities. Work has also been done within those groups, as well as in larger groups, to fight against that marginalization. It's important to remember, as you catalog LGBTQ+ works, that some of those works will have to do with more than gender and sexuality. Sometimes they'll have to do with queerness and disability, or with the Black transgender movement, or with the histories of LGBTQ+ immigrants and migrants. A broad term that covers one of those identities will likely not cover the other. It's important to do the work to find the Homosaurus terms that will make that work findable in all its facets. Again, there isn't time to cover in detail everything about intersexuality and intersectionality and about these LGBTQ+ identities that would be helpful for you all to know. So I encourage you to learn more outside of these trainings. On this slide are some selected resources for doing that, but this slide isn't the end all be all. Feel free to explore. I also want to acknowledge that many identities that are in Homosaurus did not get talked about today and will not be talked about today. They include, but are not limited to, relationship orientations, such as monogamy, non-monogamy, and polyamory, indigenous genders and sexualities like two-spirit identity, indigiqueerness, mahu, etc., BDSM and kink-related terminology, which Homosaurus is working on building out for our June or December release, and terms related to sex work and prostitution, which Homosaurus is also working on building out for our June or December release. Folks are encouraged to learn more about these identities in their own time and to find more comprehensive resources that discuss them. And again, I'll provide about a few slides at the very end of this slide deck that also has some resources in it, but I can't imagine that I will catch everything. If there are identities that you wish have been talked about or talked about in further detail today, please let me know through email or like in the evaluation that will come out at the end of this training series, I think. I want to improve this training. And so I welcome any constructive feedback that folks can offer about it. With that, are there any more questions before like I get into the closing part? Okay. So next week, next Wednesday, we'll be discussing Homosaurus sort of in full. Its scope, its structure, how it works. There will be a tour of the Homosaurus website and how to use it. And then we'll also discuss how to catalog using it in more detail. So like policies around term development and what terms exist within it, what it can be used for, what it should not be used for, as well as I'll also be pulling from the things that have been solidified in the Queer Metadata Collective, as well as what has been published and updated in the Trans Metadata Collective's best practices to further discuss cataloging queer people and cataloging trans people. On June 14th, 2 weeks from now, I'll discuss how to implement Homosaurus, so how to create sustainable projects using it. And I'll also have some practice exercises that we'll be doing live where folks can, get experience with adding subject terms to some pre-selected works. Yeah. Are there any questions before we leave off today? And for Elizabeth or Holly, is there anything that I'm forgetting to mention about the structure of this series?
Nothing I can think of. Thank you, Adrian.
Nothing I can think of either. You've been very thorough.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate seeing you all and being able to tell you more about some LGBTQ plus identities and briefly some intersections. Again, if you have any feedback about that last section, feel free to email me. Thank you all.